I'm Caroline Russell. I am a councillor in Islington. I'm the only councillor who is not in the Labour Party, so there are 47 Labour councillors and 1 Green, so that's me, which has really taught me some good political lessons. There's not many situations more frightening than going into a full council meeting where you are the only councillor from your party. And it has certainly sort of, given me a sort of bit of a political grounding. So I was elected in Islington in 2014, and then I was elected to the London Assembly in 2016, so I'm a London Assembly member as well as being an Islington councillor. Now on the London Assembly, that's my kind of day job. I'm one of 25 people, and our job is to check that the Mayor of London is doing a good job for Londoners. So there are 2 Greens, 2 UKIP, 1 Lib Dem, 8 Conservatives and 12 Labour. And what is really fantastic about the London Assembly is that we work really well cross-party. And our job is scrutiny on different committees. So I'm on the Transport Committee, I'm chair of the Environment Committee, I'm on the Economy Committee and the EU Exit Committee. And all of these committees, we work together, we find consensus where we can, and we come up with recommendations for the Mayor, and we tell the Mayor when he's not doing quite good enough. So that's just a little bit of background into who I am and how I work. I actually started out life as an artist, and I had a career as an artist, teaching at St Martin's and Chelsea College of Art. But having had my first child in the early 1990s, I decided I was going to retrain as a civil engineer. I did maths and physics A-level 1 year, did the first year of the degree, then took a year out to have our second child, and then went back and finished off the degree, and then found I was pregnant with our 3rd child, so I had a bit of time as full-time mum. And that just got me involved in community campaigning, massively involved in community campaigning, such that I was approached by the Lib Dems, Labour and the Green Party to stand in the local elections in 2010, and I joined the Green Party and have never looked back. Wasn't the quickest route to electoral success, but it was definitely the right decision for me. I think sort of as a community campaigner, I was involved in all sorts of things like, trying to change the school dinners contracts, getting rid of turkey twizzlers, doing lots of stuff around walking and cycling. As a parent of small children, you become very, very aware, if you've always just not had any kind of disability, and you've always been able to just, cross the road and run between traffic, you don't really stop to think how hostile the streets are until you are trying to get around with a small child or small children, and you just realise how frightening it is to have the very fast traffic whizzing past on roads that you're trying to hold your child's hand and walk along, how difficult it is to cross the road when there's lots of parked cars. And I got very involved in an organisation which was then called the Pedestrians Association, is now called Living Streets. And while I was sort of getting involved in Living Streets, something really shocking happened. A child was killed on the way to school. She was 4 years old, and her buggy got caught in the wheels of a heavy goods vehicle. Her name was Zara Adams, and she was 4 at the time, but she'd be in her sort of late teens, early 20s now. And it just seemed to me to be absolutely unbearable that a family could be walking their children to school and one of those children not come home safely. And so I got very involved in campaigning for 20 miles an hour speed limits, in campaigning for Vision Zero, which is all about road danger reduction, and trying to make sure that our streets are safe and decent for people who are wanting to get around on foot and by bike. So that's just a little bit of background so you know where I'm coming from. But I'm now going to talk a bit about the context that we find ourselves in. So right now, we've just had the most extraordinary year. We've had Greta Thunberg, we've had the school strikes, which certainly in Islington have grown from a few children and a few parents to kind of mass demonstrations outside the town hall. And we've had the extraordinary changes that have come about with XR and the April uprising and the recent autumn uprising, where climate change has been absolutely forced onto the agenda. And certainly as a politician, I am really seeing the difference that all of that activity is making. I'm seeing it partly in Islington, where locally all sorts of groups, Fossil-Free Islington, Transition Highbury, all the walking and the cycling campaigners, everyone is kind of re-energized and determined to make sure that the local politicians take the action they need to take to be able to address the climate emergency. Now, we had the IPCC report this time last year, which declared, that actually we've got about 10 years to take proper action and to take the climate emergency seriously. We've had the phenomenon of climate emergencies being declared by councils. We had Carla Denyer got Bristol Council to declare a climate emergency back this time last year. She was the first council to do it, and since then hundreds of councils have done it, and we've certainly, I did a motion to the London Assembly, which amazingly the Conservatives abstained, UKIP left the room, and Labour and the Liberal Democrats and the Greens all voted for it. So then this motion told the mayor that he needed to declare a climate emergency, and I thought it was going to take him a few weeks to think about it, but no, blow me down, 2 days later, in the Guardian newspaper, he declared climate emergency. And he said, I've got this fantastic new 1.5 compatible plan. I've had my environment strategy updated. And his 1.5 compatible plan is still working to a 2050 timescale. And we're still trying to push for him to bring forward the timescale so that he's working for London for a 2030 timeframe. The excuse is always, well, the government isn't going to give us the money to do the work that needs to happen to meet 1.5 compatibility by 2050, so there's no point in trying to work out what needs to happen for a 2030 timescale. Actually, there is an awful lot of point in working out what needs to happen to meet a 2030 timescale, and I realise that anyone here from XR is hoping for a 2025 timescale. I'm afraid it's as much as I can do to get the Mayor of London to even contemplate and think about 2030. But there are other bits to the overall picture. There is a crisis of physical inactivity. Anyone here who's a school governor will know that the figures for children who are overweight or obese in reception when they go into the school, and then the figures for the children who are overweight and obese when they leave at year 6 are increasing. They're just going up in a really frightening way. And this is in part due to the fact that physical activity is no longer built into people's everyday lives through their everyday journeys. Because for many people, it is easier to get in a car and to travel without actually taking physical activity yourself. And then we have the air pollution crisis. We have air in our towns and cities that we cannot trust. We cannot trust the air we breathe. That is as fundamental as not being able to trust the water we drink. I first started campaigning about air pollution back in 2011, just ahead of the 2012 mayoral election. And the shift that has happened in those sort of 8 years is really extraordinary. Back in 2011, we got hold of some of the first NO2 diffusion tubes and started putting tubes out on lamp columns and measuring the nitrogen dioxide pollution levels. Now, the nitrogen dioxide is it's a gas that comes out of the back of the exhaust pipes of diesel and petrol cars, and it has a really serious impact on our lungs, on our respiratory health, and also on our heart health. And but also there are the PM2.5 particles, which are the tiny particles from tyre wear that are so small you can't see them, but when you breathe them in, they go deep into your lungs, they can cross into your bloodstream, and that's why they are so very, very damaging. Now, there is no safe exposure level to PM2.5 particle pollution, and we are all breathing PM2.5 particle pollution every single day. But the issue with air pollution is sort of like another whole sort of people-centered set of reasons that we need to massively, massively change our transport system. We've allowed over the years a transport system to grow up that is very, very car dependent. They build whole kind of acres of new homes without any public transport, so that everyone who moves into those new homes is forced to use a car to be able to do their daily journeys and access school, shops, work, healthcare. And it is incredibly short-sighted, because the more cars we have on the road, the worse the congestion, the worse the pollution, the worse the road danger, and it's really shocking how many people are being killed and very seriously injured on our streets. There's one particular street in Islington where 2 women have each lost a leg in the last 3-4 years in collisions with heavy goods vehicles at the same location. Now, if that was happening on the railways, there would have been a shutdown of that bit of the railway, and everyone would be tearing their hair, sort of thinking, how can we stop these terrible, terrible injuries on our railway system? Because it happens on the road, where people are just used to a certain amount of death and serious injury. It's sort of accepted as an accident. And it really isn't an accident. These collisions are systemic dangers, systemic problems that we really, really should be tackling and that we should be preventing. These are preventable deaths and injuries. And to every family that has lost a loved one or has a loved one who has had a catastrophic and life-changing injury on the roads, those families, those people, the friends of those people, know only too well the impact that that has on a much wider group of people, as people either come to terms with the loss of someone or come to terms with a life that is utterly, utterly changed. One of those women is absolutely amazing, a woman called Victoria Lebrecht. She has just swum the channel. So, people are amazing, people are very resilient, but we really shouldn't be kind of allowing there to be so much death and injury on our roads. Now, so we've got the air pollution, we've got the climate change, we've got the shocking amount of death and injury on our roads. We've got the congestion. The congestion is worsened by technological changes. There are apps like Waze that allow people to rat run through residential areas so that any driver, even if they don't know an area, can take shortcuts and pass through, quite speedily very often, residential streets because they want to shave a few minutes off their journey from A to B. We also have the massive shift in the way people are shopping. So online shopping means that we have Amazon deliveries and other kind of online delivery organisations, with white vans driving around all over the country, adding to the congestion. I was speaking to someone who lives in Devon, at the end of a very, very narrow lane, and she was saying that even they, in this very remote part of rural Devon, are suffering from Amazon deliveries, kind of, you know, piling through their local lanes. So, with this overall picture, there are some really positive things, and there are things that are happening that that give me hope that we could actually change things. The Mayor of London has a transport strategy that came out now a couple of years ago that explicitly talks about reducing traffic. He has brought in an ultra-low emission zone, which currently just covers the internal congestion zone in the very centre of London, but in 2021 it will expand to the north and south circular. Now, many Londoners are campaigning for it to cover the whole of London right out to the M25, and this is because people are so worried about the state of the air that they're breathing. And they want to be able to trust the air they breathe, and they know that unless we cut traffic drastically, that's not going to be possible. In London, we're lucky because there is very good public transport, so there are options and alternatives for people, because I'm sure there are many people living here tonight who are living in a state of forced car use because there aren't any public transport options. And because the streets are so hostile and car-filled that actually the idea of riding a bike is pretty off-putting, it's a bit scary, and you know, I mean, just walking here I was kindly picked up from the station and we parked somewhere nearby, and just walking down to get to the town hall, there were roads that we had to cross, where you had to cross a really long, gaping distance because the curves of the side road were designed for cars to be able to swoop round really quickly. Those are the kind of things that can be changed, and those are the kind of things that local authorities can change relatively cheaply, but it's about squaring off those junctions so that the cars that are turning into the side roads have to slow right down and turn a much sharper corner, rather than having these very open, wide, swoopy curves that leave the crossing distance for a pedestrian really, you know, it's really intimidating. It's, I was really quite shocked to see it, because so many of the roads in London have now had their junctions squared off so that cars can't drive so fast around them. But it just reminds you that the streets feel like they have been adapted to work best for people who are driving around in cars, rather than to work best for the people who are walking, and then for the people who are cycling, and then for the people in public transport, and then for the people in cars. It's like the people in cars have been put right to the very top of the priority list. And that's the bit that is going to have to change, because if we're going to deal with the climate emergency, if we're going to clean up our air, we have to get to a point where people feel that they have real choices as alternatives to driving, so that it's possible to do the local journeys on foot, by bike, by e-bike. E-bikes are changing the whole set of possibilities. I'm sorry. Theresa May on the internet. Yes, e-bikes seriously shift what's possible. I've got quite dodgy knees these days, and I've been riding an e-bike recently, and it has transformed the distances that I ride a bike, and it has that means I'm not using the bus and the tube, which means there's a bit more space on the bus and the tube for other people who might need to use it. So yes, sorry, let me just get back to my list. Yes, so we've got to, if we're going to clean up the air, if we're going to tackle the climate emergency, we've got to get to a point where people are travelling by public transport and walking and cycling. Now there's another thing that is going on in London, which is, I think there are things for people to learn all across the country, particularly for how towns and cities are organised. And it was lovely hearing about all the little walking alleyways and things that you have here. But what they've done in Waltham Forest is to create what they call low traffic neighbourhoods. So they've taken the local area and they've marked up where the main roads are, and inside each group of main roads, they make sure that you can drive to every home, but you cannot drive from one main road to another. So this is called a low traffic neighbourhood, and people at first thought, oh, that's a bit weird. That's going to mean I'm going to have to drive much further if I want to go out, in that direction over there, because I've got to go out this way and drive all the way round. But what people have discovered is that the whole nature of those residential roads has shifted completely. People say things like, I used to go out of my front door and all I could hear was traffic, and now I can hear the birds. Every time I go to Waltham Forest and kind of cycle around with other councillors, and there's they do whole tours all the time now of the work that they've done. And I was teasing one of the councillors there, sort of saying, do you lay on these giggling children playing in every corner? And they said, no, I promise you, they just turn up every day. And it was really, it is striking how the streets have become animated, they've removed more and more parking spaces, more and more people are ditching their cars, there's people cycling through because it's convenient, it's safe. Children are playing in the street. Little shopping parades that had become dead are regenerating and are kind of new shops are opening, useful shops that sell bread and groceries. And more people are living their everyday lives, buying food as they walk home from the bus stop, or as they walk home from picking up their kids from school. And the whole nature of the area feels much less car-dominated, much, much more people-friendly. It feels like people are the top of the priority list. And it's actually not, yes, it's been quite expensive, but in the big picture, it hasn't been crazily expensive. It's about putting in bollards and putting in planters to block off through routes. They make sure, obviously, that the emergency services can get everywhere. They make sure that you can drive to every home. But it has had a massive change. And the interesting thing is, everyone thought that all the traffic would go up on the main roads. But actually, that hasn't happened. Traffic has literally evaporated. And people are just not making so many journeys. But on the main roads, it's really, really important that that's where the investment has to go. Because the people who are left on the main roads do still have the traffic. And so it's only fair that those streets are made into places that it is a pleasure to be. And they have, they've done several things. One of the things they've done is they're called Copenhagen crossings. So across the mouth of every side, you know that thing when you're walking along the main road and you're walking along and every time you get to a side road, you've got to look over your shoulder in case there's some traffic that's going to sweep in and knock you over. Well, what they've done is they've raised the pavement to the level, they've raised the road to the level of the pavement, and they've actually made the pavement surface go right across the main road. There is no the side road. There is no curb. And so as a driver, when you drive in or out of that side road, you have to drive over the pavement. And people drive very slowly and very, very carefully because the pedestrians have the priority. And it is transformatory. Because there's no rat running through the side roads, there's no one who's in a hurry, because everyone who's accessing those homes in those side roads is someone who either lives there or they're doing a delivery, but they're kind of not, they're not just trying to shave a few minutes off their journey and rat run through. So it kind of gets more quiet and courteous driving. So you've got your Copenhagen crossings. The other thing they've done are bus stop bypasses. So they have bike lanes, and then when you get to a bus stop, that's very often where the bike lane runs out. And if you're on your bike, you look over your shoulder, and you've got to try and pull out into the traffic and overtake the bus. But what they've done is they've created a bike lane on the inside of the bus stop, so that the cyclists don't have to pull out into the main fast-flowing traffic that's trying to overtake the bus. That kind of thing means that children, 8-year-olds, are cycling to school because their parents feel they can trust that the route they're driving along is not going to put their child in danger. And that is also something that is utterly transformatory. Now, there are issues with bus stop bypasses. If you're a vulnerable pedestrian, if you're an older person, if you're a bit unsteady on your feet, it's a bit of a change to think that when you get off the bus, you get onto the bus stop island, and then you do need to just look and check to see if there's a cyclist coming past, because you don't want to obviously bump into them. But the buses on routes with bus stop bypasses always say, as they're coming to the stop, there is a bus, watch out for the bike lane, there's a bus stop bypass here. So I think in practice, although it's a big change and people are kind of trying to get used to it, in practice there have not been examples of people being knocked flying by cyclists piling past. So that's an example of, where they've really, really made a big, big, massive difference. There are other things that we're calling for in London, with the ultra-low emission zone, rolling it out to the whole of London. Sian Berry and I on the London Assembly have been calling for that to be rolled out with road pricing, smart, fair road pricing. Now, I suspect we're going to get to a point where road pricing happens across the whole country. This is where you pay a micro-payment for every mile you drive. Someone okay? Hope so. You pay a micro-payment for every mile that you drive, and the payment you make depends on the emissions of your vehicle, the time of day. So in the middle of the night, it's much cheaper when the roads are less, whereas at rush hour, it's more expensive to drive. So emissions of the vehicle, the time of day, the distance you travel, and then a factor for whether or not there are any public transport alternatives. So if you're right in the very middle of London, you pay quite a big chunky fee to drive each mile along the road. If you are somewhere in a public transport desert where there are no options, you'd pay a very, very small fee per mile to drive. Smart, fair road pricing with protections for privacy it's coming down the tracks, because the vehicle excise duty is based on the emissions of your car, and as we move to more and more electric vehicles, the tax take to the Treasury from VED is going to go down. So road pricing is coming, and what we're pushing for is for it to be bought in by London so that it can be, we're not trying to have two different systems, a kind of an air pollution system with the ultra-low emission zone and a road pricing system. And what else? I'm sure I've talked for quite long enough. Let me just double... Oh yes, one more thing I wanted to talk about before we open up to questions is another thing that gives me absolute hope. I don't know if you have play streets around here? Yes? So play streets are where communities decide they're going to close their street to vehicles and open it up for play, and use street party legislation to be able to do that. And it's usually a question of putting a couple of cones, traffic cones at one end of the street, and the adults in the street kind of make sure that if someone does need to move a car, that it's done safely. And you get whole communities coming out, people of all ages coming out, sharing a cup of tea, children being able to play in the street. It's lovely. And that's been going on for quite a while now. But more recently, there have been some other developments. So one of those things is parklets. Has anyone had any parklets in Hitchin? So a parklet, the first one was set up by a woman called Brenda Pesh in Hackney, and she just took a parking bay outside her home, and she put some fake greengrocer's grass down, and a bench, and a parasol, and a couple of plant lock planters for people to lock bikes to with plants in them, and a note on that. She had a little table saying please, and a note saying please sit down and sign my visitor's book. She put a visitor's book out each day. And it was really popular. It is, if you Google Hackney Parklet, you will find out masses more about Brenda's story. But it was it caught people's imagination. And they now, in Hackney, have worked out how to suspend parking bays and let people create little mini parks in parking bays on their street, which kind of just is part of that kind of messaging about saying streets are for people and not just for cars. And the other thing that that's within this kind of area of sort of community-led street changes are school streets. And there's a school in South London who did a play street once a month, and then they started doing a play street every Friday. And their school is literally separated by a road. And so the older children are on one side of the road, the younger children on the other side. And for parents at pick-up and drop-off time, really stressful with all the kind of jostling of people trying to park and children on two different sides of the road and Anyway, they kind of all loved their Friday play streets, and they got to the point where the street was used to being closed off every Friday. They now have it formally closed every single school day from for the morning drop-off and for the afternoon pick-up. And they have barriers that come out across the road, the schoolkeeper brings them out, and the local residents have just got used to it. And visiting is just amazing because there's just a kind of sense of relaxed happiness because schools at pick-up and drop-off time can be really stressful places, and these school streets now are popping up all over London, and people say it's just taken the stress out of the morning drop-off and pick-up. It means that people have to park quite a bit further away and then walk their children the last bit. The bit outside the school itself is safe, and people are, because it's less convenient to drive, people are not driving to school so much, and so it's acting as a kind of nudge. So it's a clean air good thing. And it's also nudging people to actually either walk or cycle or take the bus to get their kids to school. So yeah, that's a little bit of hope, because I think there's a huge amount that we can do. We need some of the big decisions to be made by our local councils and by the government, but actually there's an awful lot that we can do as communities as well to start seeing our streets as more people-friendly places. So I think that's it.
Thank you very much, Caroline. That was Amazing. We would like to now open up for some questions and answers. And Annie is going to be wandering around with the microphone so that hopefully people can put their question to Caroline. Do you want to do them one by one or a couple at a time? Yeah, if we collect a couple and then look again. So should we start down the front here with these two gentlemen here? Thank you.
Can we try and have women asking questions as well? I heard the other day that if a woman asks the first question, you get more questions from women through the whole of the evening. So could we have one question from a woman in the first round of questions?
I just wanted to ask, are the government planning to kind of subsidise and improve public transport and also build cycle lanes? Because it seems a lot is focused around punishing drivers, but sometimes the other options are so bad. Like, I get public transport to work, and I do always try to on the weekend, but it's so expensive. Some villages have a bus like once a day, and it's like cancelled. It's just so bad. So are they looking to kind of improve that?
Great, thank you. Great question. So should we take whatever? Yeah, so I'm really sorry. should we take all three of these questions? So.
Okay, Dennis Harvey. Actually, mine was similar to that, so I'll ask my second question, which is, do you think an area can have too many people?
Okay, should we take the third one as well?
I've just done a petition. I come from Harpenden, but I've done a petition in St Albans to petition the council to go car-free on Sundays, and it is something they are contemplating doing apparently. But I'm also involved in other little bits and bobs in St Albans, and it's been brought to my attention that there might be some pushback from the shop owners, etc., because they're worried that if we go car-free on Sundays, it will harm their businesses. So do you know of any research, yada yada, about that? Thank you.
Three fantastic questions, thank you very much. So, starting off, obviously, the most important thing, you cannot tell people to stop driving if you don't have decent, affordable, convenient public transport in place for people to use. So absolutely, we have to invest massively, and the Green Party launched its manifesto the other day saying, you know, we're going to be spending, was it $1 billion or 10 billion? I can't remember, sorry, a year, but on green, as well as on warmer homes, on green transport options, so buses, trains, trams, every kind of possible option. And also, I think using technology, there's a possibility for kind of slightly sort of hybrid between a bus and a taxi, but run by public authorities rather than run by cowboy companies like Uber, but using that technology that is now sort of with phones very possible, where you could actually sort of aggregate. You could have routes that they go on, but that where it's possible to kind of hail a bus. So I think there are lots and lots of options of public transport that could be invested in. And then obviously, making sure that we make space on our roads for protected bike lanes, because if you have protected bike lanes, then people will cycle because they know that it's safe and it's possible. And you don't want a bike lane that runs out when the going gets tough. So very often you get a lovely stretch of bike lane along a nice stretch of road, and then you get to the junction at the end, which is actually the place where you really need the protection of protected cycling space, and it all runs out, and you're kind of left thinking, oh, where am I meant to go? You know, what am I meant to do? And we need a kind of a really joined up way of thinking about how these networks of safe bike routes actually connect together. Can an area have too many people? No. I think that density is really, really important. And if you have reasonably dense living, then it is possible to have car-free living, so where all the things you need to get to are within walking distance or cycling distance or local bus distance, and it's the kind of the sprawling out where you end up with built-in car dependence, where people are literally feel forced to own a car in order to be able to live their life and get around. And if you think about that, if you think about the inefficiency of cars in relation to the climate emergency, the motor manufacturers have somehow managed to make it normal that any adult, anyone over 17 is it, that you can learn to drive, has a car. And so you have a problem in towns and villages of not enough places to store these cars. These cars are kind of, they end up jumping up on the pavement a bit or kind of blocking a driveway, because there literally is not enough space for all these cars while they're waiting to be used. Because most cars are used just 5% of the time. So 95% of the time, a car is parked. And there's the whole carbon cost of the car, the plastic, the rubber of the tyres, the metal, all the materials that make a car are part of that car's carbon footprint. And so that car is only used 5% of the time. It's an incredibly inefficient esse of resources. And then everyone has had the experience of being in heavy traffic, where you're kind of in a queue waiting to get through a difficult junction. While you're in that traffic queue, you are breathing whatever is coming out of the tailpipe of the car in front of you. And you're wasting fuel, you're wasting time, and actually, if you started from scratch, you would never decide that individual vehicles that have like 2 armchairs in the front and a sofa in the back, you would never decide that was an efficient way to get people around for, going to the shops. It's just extraordinary that we just think it's normal to use all that energy to move the sofa and the spare armchair while you're driving to the shops. So, I don't think you can have too many people in an area. I think the problems come when actually everyone's spread out a bit, and so you've got too much car use, and you can certainly have too many cars in an area. And then car-free Sundays, neatly coming on to. Car-free days are amazing. We need more of them. And because they're one of the ways that people can start to see how different our streets can be. So the City of London, back in the summer, in September, for International Car-Free Day, closed all the streets in the City of London. It was a horrible, wet, rainy day, but loads and loads of people were out. And people were walking, cycling, playing, sitting around, listening to music. But it was it was just a lovely way of seeing the streets in London not completely clogged up with buses, cars, lorries, vans. In terms of shop owners, look up the Pedestrian Pound, which is a report that was done by Living Streets. It was done a few years ago, but they've just updated it very recently. So it's called the Pedestrian Pound. If you just Google that, your other search engines are available. You will find it. And that gives all the arguments to give to the shopkeepers, the shop owners, about footfall. But basically, the message of the Pedestrian Pound is that if you have a streetscape that is a pleasant place to be, people will dwell there. And people who dwell sit down and have a coffee or kind of hang around and then spot something, do a bit of window shopping. It's easy to cross the road because it's not a kind of traffic motorway coming through, so people will go from one side of the road to the other side of the road, and actually the shopkeepers really see the benefit in terms of increased footfall. So making your streets into nice places to be, nice places to hang around, places that are easy to cross, that is a way of helping your shopkeepers. And shopkeepers often have a disproportionate sense of the number of people who come by car. They think that most of their passengers, most of their customers come by car, and actually surprisingly large numbers of people come on foot or by bike. And if you get a parade of shops that starts being a nice place, then more and more people locally will shop there rather than getting in their car and driving off to a local sort of superstore. And is that person in the middle here? Yeah. Yeah, go for it, and then, yes, the person in the blue with the scarf and the glasses. Yes.
You've said nothing about air travel so far. What are your views about that, particularly in relation to the expansion of Luton Airport?
Hi. My question is about living in a rural county where people have to get from their village or their countryside house to town or from their home to work, which might be not in the direction of public transport. How do you wean people off individual car travel when there is so little alternative available? And is it practical to have empty buses roaming around the countryside? Because that is often the thing that, is dying out.
Great, okay, so we'll start off with the air travel. Air travel has no place in a country that is taking the climate emergency seriously, and certainly expansion of air travel has absolutely no place. I mean, obviously as a London politician, we have City Airport and we have Heathrow Airport, both expanding, and both having been consulting recently. And it has been my job as chair of the Environment Committee to come up with the London Assembly's consultation responses. And so I've had to do quite a lot of work to get cross-party support for an anti-expansion position, but we've actually managed to get to a point where the London Assembly's view is there should be no aviation expansion anywhere in London, which has been, it was, when I first became chair of the committee, I wasn't allowed to say anything in public as chair of the committee about expansion because it wasn't an agreed position. So we have managed to get to that point. And one of the ways that we got to that point was by dealing with the impact of noise on overflown communities, because there is nothing like local politicians having to listen to people whose lives are literally being made I mean, people describe it as a living hell. I have some people who tweet me every single morning when the first flight goes over their home. And anyone who ends up, the airports are doing something at the moment called flight path concentration. And this is, it sounds relatively innocuous. They talk about airspace modernisation. And it's basically switching off radar and switching on sat-nav. And for some of the communities in southeast London, they experienced it a few years ago as literally someone flicking a switch. And having, there's one of the campaigners who runs a campaign called Plain Hell, told me that she lived in her home in southeast London for 30 years and never suffered from aircraft noise. The day they flicked the switch and they turned on the sat-nav flying, she then now has planes going over 1 a minute from first thing in the morning till last thing at night. And the problem with concentrated flight paths is that they divide and rule communities, because what they do is they mean that a few people are very, very badly overflown. And when these airports are doing their consultations around their flight paths, it's always a bit difficult to work out who is going to be underneath the flight paths. And the airports have tried to divide and rule communities so that you get a community around Heathrow, you get people in Richmond, in Hounslow, different places who are campaigning locally against aircraft noise. But because those campaigners are each fighting their own corner, the airports are just able to run rings around us all and kind of get away with doing what they want to do. So the big challenge for communities is to stick together and try and make sure that any concentration of flight paths doesn't disbenefit one community particularly, because you really don't want to end up underneath a concentrated flight path. And actually, the airports could design the flight paths so that the pain of the aircraft noise is better shared out. And I would dearly love there to be no planes at all, but we live in a globalized world. We have people who use aeroplanes for visiting family overseas, maybe once a year. We're spread around the place. Not everyone is able to take enough time off work to be able to go to the other side of the world by boat to see family. So there is going to be some flying in our lives going forwards, but the point is we want to make sure that there isn't more of it, and that the flying that there is doesn't disbenefit some communities worse than others. Did I cover? Yes. So I'm afraid I don't know very much about the particular picture at Luton, but I hope that's given you some useful stuff. There is actually a report that the London Assembly did on overflying and concentrated flight paths, which I could send through and could be circulated to people who've signed up. And then the other question was about rural areas and villages, towns, and the fact that there's currently absolutely no alternatives. That is absolutely true, and we have to put in place the public transport. We have to make sure that no more homes are built which are forced into car use. If you're building new homes in a greenfield site, then the public transport should go in first, because then the workers who are building the homes can get there by public transport, and the public transport will be in place for the people when they move in. It's obviously not fair to penalise people for driving if there is no choice about how they get around. But we do have to make sure that we are putting in place those alternatives, because in my view, anyone who currently has a petrol or a diesel car should keep it going for as long as possible and drive it as little as possible, and then not replace it. And by the time that car has gone, there must be enough public transport options in place for people to be able to live well without a car. Electric vehicles are another interim technology, but they are still vehicles. They still add to the road danger, they still add to the congestion, and most importantly, they still add to the PM2.5 particle pollution, to which there is no safe exposure level. So electric vehicles, and the other thing is there is not enough lithium in the world to replace every single fossil-fueled car with an electric car. So that, electric cars are not going to get us through the climate emergency. We have got to change the transport system and make sure that there are buses, trams, and trains available for people. In Germany, in Holland, they have created proper networks of public transport so that you can catch a bus to the nearest small town, you can catch a tram or a train to the bigger town. All the trains, and in Switzerland they do this, all the trains connect with each other properly, the timetables work. They've invested in proper public transport infrastructure so people have choices, and that's what we have to do in the UK. Yeah. Have we got another? I'm hoping there's a woman with a hand up. Yes, there is in the middle. Man at the back and woman in the third row.
Hello, can you hear me? My question is how we get things changed. I'm interested to hear what you think might be ways of getting small organisations, which are quite a large number around here, opposed to Luton expansion. But I'm interested to know what could or should be done to get them to collaborate more effectively so that they have a bigger impact. By way of an example, Stott Stansted expansion seems to have a much larger organisation. It has, I think it's 7,500 members, and I've been told it has a budget to build on a bank balance of nearly £2 million. The organisation that I'm from, Ladacan, has about £5,000 and 300 members. So the question is really, how do we get people to work together and not continue hoeing their own road?
Thank you. My name's Susan, and I've really enjoyed what I've heard so far. It's been very inspiring, Caroline. Thank you. I was talking to some transport campaigners earlier in the week when the Luton Airport expansion consultation was happening in this very place, and somebody mentioned there's a feeling that, or somebody's been told, there's a lot of Section 106 money sitting in North Herts District Council unspent. I don't know how much it is, but some people have heard that it's quite an embarrassingly large amount of Section 106 money. And what it would be really useful to hear from you is, do you know what kinds of things, creatively, Section 106 money could be used for? Particularly whether it could be used for a sort of strategic overview study or something that might add some real intelligence and a new game-changing perspective to North Hertfordshire, rather than some of the things that perhaps have been tried before. Thank you.
Okay. So, starting off with the how do we get organisations to work together and collaborate. It's about getting people talking to each other. If you've got one very big organisation, they will presumably see themselves as kind of leaders of a particular campaign. But my experience in London is that there are multiple campaign organisations, particularly campaigning against aviation, who are all campaigning to get the local authorities and all the relevant politicians collaborating to campaign as well. So, for instance, there's a court case against the Heathrow third runway, which has got the Mayor of London, it's got various boroughs that are affected, it's got Plan B, who is a kind of campaigning legal organisation, based on there is no plan B. So there's been, and then all the different, there's no third runway, there's no Heathrow, there's Haycan, there's various aviation campaign groups and lots of hyper-local ones that have all come together under an umbrella. And I think if it's possible to try and get, there's the No Third Runway Coalition, for instance, who are a campaign organisation, who have been they are just getting a coalition of different campaigning organisations together to campaign against the third runway. And I think that kind of way of working is the way to do it. So you're not just trying to say, we're quite a small anti-aviation campaign and we want to campaign with you big organisation. It's kind of saying, we've got this group and this group and this church group and this council and this WI group, think across civil society and get as many allies together as possible. And those allies don't have to be people who campaign against airports. They might be people who campaign for better walking and cycling facilities, or they might be people who make pots of jam. They might be people who, have a particular religious faith. But you need to sort of really think of all the different groups within civil society and the politicians and work towards getting that kind of coalition together. If you want an introduction to the No Third Runway Coalition people, find me at the end and I'll happy to put you in touch with them, because I think the way they've campaigned has been very, very effective, because it's kind of much harder for the airport to divide and rule when all the campaigners are working together and amplifying each other's voices. Then Susan, Section 106 money unspent, a large amount, delicious. There's all sorts of things that they could do studies on that would be good use. I mean, it depends. Section 106 money, and now it's community infrastructure levy money, often has particular things that it's meant to be spent on. So obviously I'm talking, just assuming right now for the purposes of this answer, that it is money that is available to kind of think about transport. But one thing to think about would be looking into doing a workplace parking levy. That's something they did in Nottingham, where they introduced a workplace parking levy, so anyone who parked at work had to pay a fee to Nottingham Council, and Nottingham Council borrowed a lot of money to build a new tram system to provide people with an alternative to driving. And the workplace parking levy is paying off the borrowing that they spent on the tram, as well as obviously the tram is paying itself as well now. But that is a really, really good example of a way in an area where there's a lot of car use, a way to kind of make that shift, because it's about putting in place a new good piece of public transport, and at the same time making sure that the people who are driving are contributing to providing it. So it's a nudge to do less driving, and it's a way of providing new public transport. So that would be one of the things on my list. I think the other thing would be really thinking about how to make the streets within the boundaries of the town as people-friendly as possible. So to bring in low-traffic neighbourhoods and to make sure that the main roads are all prioritising people. So prioritising people at pedestrian crossings, having, that example I gave of the kind of the junctions where the junction mouth is such a wide gaping gap that if you're a bit unsteady on your feet, or if you're travelling with, trying to walk around with very small children, every road you have to cross is a real challenge, and that's a real disincentive to walking. It's much more likely, if it's a kind of 10-15 minute walk, and it could be 5 minutes and none of those nasty crossings in a car, then people are going to get in the car. And so it's making sure that the experience of walking is convenient and pleasant and you feel like you matter. And there are so many places where when you are trying to walk, it just feels like you don't matter and the people who are driving in cars matter an awful lot more. And that's the wrong way round. So I think that's what I'd focus on.
My name's Cheryl. You were talking about a driving charge you think is on its way, which I think is, you know, there's the situation of trying to make walking and cycling and all that more attractive, but also trying to cut off demand like driving charges. I feel that's also necessary with aviation. I feel that there are a lot of cheap flights. There are frequent flyer reward programs, and it just sort of fuels that economy. And in the meanwhile, you've got government policy, which I learned from the consultation we had on Tuesday for Luton expansion, being that we should make more use of our runways. Therefore, we have to expand use of our existing runways. So the whole thing is sort of topsy-turvy, and you know, we need to challenge that demand, I think.
You mentioned what's happening in Germany, Holland, and Switzerland with integrated public transport systems. Could you say a bit more about how those are funded? Whether the private sector is in there or whether it's some mix and match. And then very quickly somebody worked out many years ago that the average speed that one travels in a car is 5 miles an hour. And that's based really on what you were saying, the amount of time it's parked, the amount of money you have to earn to buy it, service it, insurance, and find it in the multi-story when you can't quite remember where it is and stuck in traffic jam. It works out at 5 miles an hour.
That's fantastic. I'm going to start with the flying and the cheap flights. I mean, obviously, we need to be taxing flying properly. At the moment, the airports are able to sort of get away. The aviation emissions that get counted don't count the emissions while they're actually flying, once they've left British airspace. So the way that it's all calculated is very topsy-turvy. We clearly need more aviation taxes and we need a frequent flyer levy. So you have higher aviation taxes, and then on top of that, you have one return flight a year without the frequent flyer levy, and after that, it just goes up with every extra flight. So that way, you don't, if someone has family somewhere else in the world, they are able to have a return flight without the extra frequent flyer levy. But for someone who is deciding to fly to various different places for the weekend, they will find that gets increasingly expensive through the year as they fly more and more. And that hopefully will be a disincentive to people to fly so much. So absolutely, we need to be thinking about how we tax aviation very, very differently. And whether you think about flying in terms of the carbon emissions and the harm it's doing in terms of how we can tackle the climate emergency, or whether you think about it as the harm of overflying communities. But there are schools near Heathrow where the children play in the playground in igloos, concrete igloos in the playground, so that the children's ears don't get damaged. I mean, it is absolutely shocking what we put up with. And then there are households who get the mitigation, they get the money to be able to put in double glazing. But double glazing is absolutely no use at all in the middle of a heat wave in the summer when you actually want to have your windows open to let the cool air into the house in the evening. So it's, we've got to think about the harm that aviation causes to the community and in terms of climate emissions, and make sure that the tax regime for flying is suitable for that. And then Germany, Holland, Switzerland. I don't have at the tips of my fingers a kind of sort of thing about exactly how they fund their transport system. I know they put a lot more public money into their transport system, and they haven't got the kind of ridiculous kind of broken up system where the track is run by one company and the trains are run by another company, and if you've got the trains from one company and another company, and they're meant to, people are meant to be changing from one train to another, and one train is late, the other train won't wait for even 3 minutes because there's some kind of punitive thing that kicks in if they leave the station late. So we obviously need to have a much, much more joined up system in the UK, but I'm afraid I'm not, particularly this late in the evening, I'm not going to try and dredge out, I'm not going to try and dredge it out of the back of my brain. Average speed 5 miles an hour, what a brilliant thing to end on. It's the time it takes, yes, the sort of the driving. If it takes longer to park and you've got to walk a bit further, that's one of the things that the sort of nudges of low traffic neighbourhoods actually will help people to give up on using cars. And I think the other thing is that we really need to think about the sort of the technological changes that are happening. So there's the someone was saying about empty buses in the countryside, and I do think that the kind of Uber-type technology, not the Uber company, but the Uber-type technology, where you kind of use smartphones and the internet and mobile phone signal to kind of locate people and transport options. The potential for a kind of hybrid bus-type system is very, very strong. I just think we're going to have to stop driving, and we might as well make sure that our streets and our towns and cities become better, more human, more people-friendly places as we do it.
Caroline Russell, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much. Thank you.